Store mocks woman in Harris hat, then finds out she just bought it. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The wind was crisp that morning as Karen Hughes pulled her coat tighter around her, adjusting the red, white, and blue cap on her head. It wasn't just any cap. This one was brand new, purchased only minutes ago from a small stand inside the bustling Shoe Zone plaza. The bold word Harris, stitched across the front, caught the sunlight as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her scarf fluttering against the cold breeze. Karen wasn't a person who enjoyed drama. She liked her days simple: grocery runs, quick shopping trips, and a warm cup of coffee waiting for her at home. But today felt good. The cap had caught her eye the moment she entered the small vendor's corner, and something about it made her smile. Maybe it was the bright colors or the perfectly snug fit, but she hadn't hesitated to buy it. As Karen adjusted her scarf and turned toward her car, she didn't notice the tall woman storming toward her. That is, until she heard an unmistakably sharp voice pierce the morning air. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me?" Karen froze mid-step, glancing to her left. Standing there, fuming, was a woman in a dark blue parka with a fur-lined hood. Her blonde hair hung in loose waves, and her expression was twisted with anger, or maybe disgust. "Excuse me?" Karen said, blinking in confusion. The woman stepped closer, pointing a finger at Karen's cap like it was some kind of personal offense. "Where on earth did you get that hat?" Karen instinctively touched the brim, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong with it?" The woman, whose name Karen would later learn was Jessica Langley, let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Are you serious? That hat is ridiculous. People like you are exactly what's wrong with this country." Karen blinked, her face flushing with confusion and embarrassment. "What do you mean, people like me? I just bought this hat from the store inside." Jessica's eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "Oh, of course you did. You're walking around like you're proud of it. That's just perfect." The word stung, though Karen couldn't figure out why. This wasn't the kind of confrontation she was used to, random, sudden, and fueled by, what? A hat? "Look," Karen said slowly, trying to keep her voice calm. "I don't know what your problem is, but I like this hat. That's why I bought it. If you don't like it, that's not my issue." Jessica scoffed, stepping closer until the space between them felt far too small. A few passers-by began to slow their steps, casting curious glances toward the argument unfolding in front of Shoe Zone. "Not your issue?" Jessica said, her voice rising. "Do you even know what that hat means? Do you know what kind of message you're sending by wearing it out here like some kind of badge of honor?" Karen stared at her, genuinely baffled. "It's just a hat. What are you talking about?" Jessica let out another bitter laugh, loud enough to make the small group of onlookers murmur amongst themselves. "Wow. You can't seriously be this clueless?" Karen felt her heart pounding in her chest as heat rose to her cheeks. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, especially not over something so trivial. People were starting to stare, really stare, and Karen hated the way it made her feel like she'd done something wrong when she hadn't. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are," Karen said, her voice shaking slightly, "but I don't owe you an explanation for a hat I bought with my own money." Jessica smirked, her arms still crossed like she'd already won some invisible argument. "Maybe you should do some research before you go throwing your money around. It's embarrassing for you, honestly." Karen's confusion turned to anger. She couldn't believe the audacity of this stranger, someone she'd never even met, accusing her of something so ridiculous. She glanced at the people standing nearby, their eyes wide with curiosity. A few teenagers had their phones out, clearly recording the exchange. "Great," Karen muttered under her breath. "Now I'm a sideshow." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Maybe you shouldn't wear things you can't defend. People are going to call you out. That's life." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Both women turned to see a middle-aged man in a blue store uniform standing in the doorway of Shoe Zone. His name tag read Tom. He looked between Karen and Jessica, his face creased with concern. Karen exhaled in relief. Finally, someone reasonable. Jessica, however, wasted no time jumping in. "What's going on is that she jabbed a finger toward Karen, is walking around wearing that stupid hat and acting like it's normal." Tom blinked, glancing at Karen's hat before frowning slightly. "The Harris hat?" Karen nodded quickly, her voice steady as she spoke. "Yes. I bought it from one of the stands inside the plaza this morning. I liked it, so I bought it. And now I'm getting harassed for no reason." Tom turned to Jessica, his expression hardening. "Is this really necessary?" "She bought the hat. It's not hurting anyone. Jessica threw her hands up in exasperation. Not hurting anyone? Are you kidding me? That hat is ridiculous. It's embarrassing. Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I don't know what this is all about, but we don't need a scene out here. If you have an issue, take it somewhere else. Karen shot Jessica a triumphant look, though her heart was still pounding from the confrontation. Thank you, she said to Tom, adjusting her scarf and hat as she turned to walk toward her car. This is the last thing I needed today. But Jessica wasn't finished. Oh no, she said loudly, making sure everyone within earshot could hear. You don't get to walk away from this like it's nothing. People need to know when they're making fools of themselves. Karen froze mid-step. She turned slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she faced Jessica. Why are you doing this? Do you really have nothing better to do than harass strangers over something that doesn't even concern you? Jessica smirked, clearly relishing the attention. Maybe it doesn't concern me, but someone has to say something. You can't just go around wearing things like that and pretending it's okay. Karen clenched her fists, the anger bubbling to the surface. You're unbelievable. And you're clueless, Jessica shot back. Before Karen could respond, a familiar voice called out from behind her. Ma'am? Excuse me? Karen turned to see the young vendor from the stand where she'd purchased the hat jogging toward her. He was holding a small plastic bag, his face flushed from the cold. Sorry to interrupt, he said, slightly out of breath. You left your receipt at the stand. I thought you might need it. Karen blinked, momentarily thrown by the interruption. Oh, thank you. The vendor turned to Jessica, clearly confused by the tension in the air. Is everything okay? Jessica rolled her eyes, crossing her arms again. Not really. She's walking around in that ridiculous hat, and she doesn't even know what it means. The vendor frowned, looking from Jessica to Karen. What's wrong with the hat? I sell those all the time. Jessica let out a bitter laugh. Of course you do. No wonder. Karen took the receipt from the vendor with shaking hands, forcing herself to breathe. I'm done here, she said, her voice sharp. I don't have time for this nonsense. As she turned to walk away, she could still hear Jessica's voice ringing in her ears. You'll figure it out eventually, Jessica called. You'll see how embarrassing this really is. Karen kept walking, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She didn't know why Jessica had picked a fight with her, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this ruin her day. At least that's what she told herself. But deep down the doubt had started to creep in. Karen's hands trembled as she fumbled for her car keys. The biting wind stung her face, but the burn was nothing compared to the humiliation simmering in her chest. Her heart still raced from the exchange as she climbed into her old sedan, slamming the door shut behind her. She sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. Outside, the sound of faint laughter drifted toward her, likely from the teenagers who had been recording. She could still picture Jessica's smug face, that awful smirk like she'd somehow won an argument Karen didn't even understand. It's just a hat, Karen whispered under her breath, glancing at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The cap perched snugly on her head, the word Harris stitched across the front in bright, bold letters. She pulled it off, tossing it onto the passenger seat like it was suddenly too heavy to wear. What was that even about? She muttered to herself. Why did she act like I did something so wrong? A sharp knock on her window made her jump. Karen turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat, but it was only Tom, the Shoe Zone employee who had intervened earlier. He stood outside her car, wearing his blue work jacket and looking concerned. Karen rolled the window down halfway. Hey, Tom said gently, his breath misting in the cold air. You okay? Karen forced a tight smile, though her voice wavered. I'm fine. Just a little shaken up. Tom nodded slowly, his expression sympathetic. Yeah, that woman was way out of line. People like her just look for reasons to get mad, you know? Karen sighed, running a hand through her hair. I guess. I just don't get it. It's a hat. What's the big deal? Tom scratched his head, glancing at the cap sitting on her passenger seat. Honestly, I don't think it's about the hat itself. Some people just see what they want to see, and they use it as an excuse to take their bad mood out on someone else. Karen frowned, shaking her head. But she acted like the hat meant something awful. Like I was trying to send some kind of message. Do you know what she was talking about? Tom shrugged. Not a clue. I've seen people wear that exact hat 100 times, bought right here in this plaza. No one's ever made a fuss about it before. Karen sighed again, feeling a knot in her stomach. Well, she made sure I felt like a criminal for wearing it. Tom smiled faintly. Try not to let it get to you. She's just one person. Karen nodded, offering him a weak smile. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate you stepping in back there. Anytime, Tom replied. He glanced at his watch before stepping back. Take care, okay? Karen rolled up the window as Tom walked back toward the store. For a moment, she sat in silence, staring at the hat on the seat beside her. It stared back at her, bright and bold, as if daring her to put it back on. By the time Karen pulled into her driveway, the weight of the day had settled deep into her bones. She grabbed her purse and the cap, climbing out of the car with a sigh. Her small, cozy house sat nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by bare trees and patches of frost-covered grass. Inside, the smell of vanilla candles greeted her, and she exhaled softly, thankful for the stillness. She set the hat on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water, staring at the cap as she sipped. What am I even supposed to do with you? She muttered to herself. Karen walked into the living room and sank onto the couch, pulling her phone from her pocket. She hesitated before unlocking it, dreading what she might find. Sure enough, notifications began pouring in, texts from friends, social media pings, and a few news alerts that made her stomach drop. Her hands trembled as she opened Facebook. There it was. A video. The thumbnail froze on her face, mid-argument, with Jessica's finger pointed accusingly at her hat. The caption underneath read, "Woman in controversial hat confronted outside store. What was she thinking?" Karen's mouth went dry. She clicked on the video, her heart pounding as it began to play. It started innocently enough, her stepping out of the store, adjusting her scarf. But then Jessica's sharp voice cut through, loud and biting, as the video zoomed in on Karen's confused expression. "What's wrong with that hat?" Karen's voice echoed from the screen. "Oh, you don't know?" "Of course you don't," Jessica replied smugly. The video ended with Karen's retreat to her car, Jessica calling after her, and a group of teenagers laughing in the background. Karen stared at the screen, her hands shaking. The video had already been shared over 100 times. The comments made her stomach churn. How clueless can you be? That hat is disgusting. She looked so embarrassed. Good. People need to educate themselves before walking around like that. Karen's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. What did I do wrong? She whispered to herself. She swiped through the comments, searching for answers. Something, anything, that might explain why this was happening. Finally, one comment caught her eye. It's not the hat itself. Look up the brand Harris and what happened last year. She should have known better. Karen frowned, wiping her tears as she opened a search engine and typed in the words, Harris hat controversy. The results appeared instantly, and Karen's heart sank as she read the headlines. Harris clothing brand accused of offensive slogan missteps. The hat that sparked outrage. Why Harris faced backlash. What does the Harris hat really mean? Karen clicked on one of the articles, her hands trembling as she read. A year ago, the Harris clothing brand had found itself in hot water after releasing a series of controversial slogans on its apparel. While the original intention had been to promote patriotism and unity, the designs had unintentionally offended large portions of the public. The backlash had been swift, with protests erupting and stores pulling the items from shelves. And now, just seeing the word Harris on clothing was enough to stir anger and judgment from anyone familiar with the controversy. Karen stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. I didn't know, she whispered. It all made sense now, Jessica's anger, the laughter from the teenagers, the video spreading like wildfire. Karen hadn't known anything about the controversy, but that didn't matter. In the eyes of strangers, she had already been judged and condemned. She buried her face in her hands, tears slipping through her fingers. I just thought it was a hat, she whispered. How was I supposed to know? The next morning, Karen woke up with a knot in her chest. She hadn't slept much, the events of the previous day playing on an endless loop in her mind. Her phone buzzed constantly, calls she ignored, texts she couldn't bring herself to read. When she finally dragged herself out of bed, she glanced at the kitchen counter where the Harris hat still sat. It seemed smaller now, less bold, as though it too felt the weight of the trouble it had caused. Karen's phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up, her breath catching when she saw the caller ID. It was Tom. Karen answered, her voice hoarse. Hello? Hey Karen, it's Tom, he said, his tone careful. I just wanted to check on you. Are you okay? Karen sighed, sinking into a chair. Not really. I figured, Tom replied. Look, I saw the video going around and I'm sorry this happened to you. That woman had no right to do what she did. Karen swallowed hard. It's not just her. It's everyone. I didn't even know about the controversy, Tom. I bought the hat because I liked it. I know, Tom said gently. That's the thing about people. They're quick to judge even when they don't have all the facts. Karen wiped her eyes. What do I do now? People think I did this on purpose? Tom paused before answering. You tell the truth, Karen. That's all you can do. Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. It had been 2 days since the confrontation outside Shoe Zone, but it felt like an eternity. The video had spread far and wide, shared on news websites, forums, and social media pages. Her phone buzzed for the 100th time that morning. Karen ignored it. She already knew what it would be: another message, another comment, another voice joining the chorus of people who had decided they knew everything about her. What an embarrassment. She's probably just playing dumb. How can someone be so clueless? Karen didn't think it was possible to feel so small. Every word chipped away at her confidence, until all she wanted to do was crawl under a blanket and disappear. She glanced at the Harris hat, which still sat on the counter. The bright colors that had once made her smile now felt like a scarlet letter, a symbol of something ugly she'd been accused of without understanding why. Maybe I should throw it away, she thought. The idea lingered in her mind, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't the hat's fault. She hadn't bought it to offend anyone. And yet, Karen buried her face in her hands, tears burning her eyes. How did this get so out of control? Later that afternoon, Karen forced herself to step outside. The small grocery store down the road was usually quiet, and she hoped the trip would give her a sense of normalcy, anything to distract from the storm raging in her head. She parked her car and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The sound of soft music playing through the speakers calmed her slightly as she grabbed a basket and headed toward the produce section. But it didn't take long for the whispers to start. That's her. Yeah, the one with the hat. She's all over the internet. Karen kept her eyes on the apples, pretending not to hear them. Her hands shook as she reached for one, but it slipped from her grasp and tumbled to the floor, rolling out of reach. Let me get that for you. Karen turned sharply, startled by the voice. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, wearing a store apron and holding the apple out with a small, hesitant smile. Thank you, Karen mumbled, taking the fruit and placing it in her basket. The young woman lingered for a moment, as though trying to decide whether to say more. Finally she spoke. I saw the video, she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. It wasn't fair what they did to you. Karen blinked, surprised. You think so? The woman nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Yeah. I mean, maybe some people care about the controversy, but that woman? She just wanted to pick a fight. You didn't do anything wrong. Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking. The woman smiled faintly before turning back toward the stockroom, leaving Karen standing there, clutching her basket like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. That evening, Karen sat in her living room, staring at the blank television screen. The encounter with the young woman had stuck with her, replaying in her mind like a broken record. You didn't do anything wrong. The words gave her a sliver of comfort, but they didn't erase the damage. The world had already made up its mind about her, and trying to change that felt impossible. Karen's gaze drifted to the Harris hat sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up, running her fingers over the stitching. It was just fabric and thread, no more, no less. Maybe it's time to say something, she murmured. She grabbed her phone and opened Facebook. Her heart raced as she tapped out a new post, her fingers trembling with every word. To everyone who has seen the video of me outside Shoe Zone, I want to explain something. I bought the Harris hat that morning because I liked how it looked. I didn't know about the controversy surrounding it, and I never intended to offend anyone. I've spent the past few days feeling humiliated and judged by people who don't know me. I'm not perfect, but I'm not the villain some of you have made me out to be. I made an honest mistake and I'm learning from it. To those who have sent kind messages, thank you. And to those who haven't, I hope you'll consider that sometimes there's more to a story than what you see in a 2-minute video. Karen stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the post button. Doubt gnawed at her. Would this make things worse? Would anyone even listen? She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Then she hit post. The screen refreshed, and Karen set the phone down on the table, her hands shaking. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also relieved. For the first time since the incident, she'd spoken for herself. The next morning, Karen woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. She groaned, rolling over and squinting at the screen. There were dozens of notifications. Her Facebook post had taken off. Some of the comments were harsh, people doubling down on their judgment, but others were unexpectedly supportive. I believe you. Not everyone knows everything, and it's not fair to assume they do. People need to stop attacking strangers. This woman doesn't deserve this. You handled this with grace. Don't let the haters win. Karen felt tears prick her eyes as she scrolled through the responses. For the first time, it seemed like people were listening, really listening, to her side of the story. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Tom. Hey Karen, I saw your post. You did the right thing. Let me know if you need anything. I've got your back. Karen smiled faintly, her heart lifting just a little. Later that day, Karen returned to Shoe Zone. The parking lot was less crowded this time, and she felt a little stronger as she stepped out of her car. The Harris hat was tucked into her bag, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she didn't want to invite another scene. Inside, Tom greeted her with a warm smile. Hey Karen. How are you holding up? Better, she said honestly. Thanks for checking in. Tom nodded. Good to hear. I saw a couple of people sharing your post earlier. It's nice to see some positivity for once. Karen smiled faintly. Yeah. I guess not everyone's out to tear me down. Tom chuckled. That's the internet for you. Half of it's a mess and the other half's just trying to clean it up. Karen laughed softly, the sound surprising even her. That's one way to put it. She wandered through the store for a few minutes, browsing the shelves and enjoying the quiet. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory, a chance to reclaim the place where the whole mess had started. As she walked back toward the exit, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the window. Jessica Langley. Karen's heart skipped a beat. Jessica was on her phone, her expression bored as she scrolled through the screen. Karen hesitated for a moment, her palms clammy. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave, but another part, the braver part, decided otherwise. She walked straight past Jessica, her chin held high. Jessica glanced up, her expression flickering with recognition. For a brief second, their eyes met, but Karen didn't stop. She pushed through the doors and stepped into the sunlight, her steps steady and sure. For the first time in days, she felt like herself again. Karen's steps were steady as she walked toward her car. The bright sunlight felt warmer on her face this time, a sharp contrast to the cold, heavy humiliation she'd carried days before. Seeing Jessica again had stirred something inside her, not anger but resolve. She climbed into the driver's seat, setting her bag carefully beside her. The Harris hat was still tucked inside, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. Karen glanced into the rearview mirror, catching her own reflection. You don't get to control how I feel, she said softly, as if the words were directed at Jessica, at the internet, or maybe just at the self-doubt that had plagued her since the incident. As she pulled out of the parking lot, her phone buzzed with a notification. At the next red light, she glanced down to see a message from a name she didn't recognize, Emily Richards. The preview read, Hi Karen, I just wanted to say. Curious, Karen parked outside a small cafe she sometimes visited and opened the message. Hi Karen, I just wanted to say that I saw your Facebook post. I was at the plaza that day. I didn't know what to do when that woman started yelling at you, but I felt awful for not stepping in. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You're braver than I could ever be, and I wanted you to know I support you. Take care. Emily ***. Karen felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was relief, validation even, from someone she didn't know but who had been there. She wasn't completely alone after all. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this one from an old coworker she hadn't heard from in years. Saw your post, Karen. I'm so sorry people were so quick to judge you. Hang in there. You've got this. Karen smiled faintly, her heart lifting with each new notification. The messages kept coming throughout the afternoon, small bursts of kindness breaking through the noise. Good for you for standing up for yourself. Don't let them get to you. You're stronger than they are. That woman had no right to treat you like that. For the first time since the incident, Karen felt like the tide was turning. The world that had seemed so quick to condemn her was beginning to show its other side, a side she had nearly forgotten existed. That evening, Karen sat on her porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Harris hat sat beside her on the table, no longer a source of dread but a reminder of how far she'd come. Her phone buzzed again and Karen hesitated before picking it up. This time it was a news article sent by Tom, the Shoe Zone employee. From viral shame to strength. Woman speaks out about harassment over Harris hat. Karen blinked, surprised to see her name in print. She clicked on the link and read through the article. It was short but sympathetic, recounting the events outside the store and highlighting Karen's response on social media. The final paragraph made her pause. While the hat's history remains divisive, Karen Hughes' story is a reminder that assumptions can cause harm and that everyone deserves a chance to be heard. Karen put the phone down, tears pooling in her eyes. She had never wanted to be a story. She hadn't asked for any of this. But maybe, just maybe, some good could come from it. Maybe people would think twice before judging someone they didn't know. The next morning, Karen woke up feeling lighter than she had in days. The anxiety that had weighed her down since the confrontation was still there, but it no longer felt insurmountable. She had survived the worst of it, and now she was ready to move forward. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Hey Karen. A reporter came by the store this morning asking about what happened that day. I didn't say much, just told her you were a nice person who didn't deserve any of this. I think she wants to talk to you though. Let me know if you're interested." Karen stared at the message, her heart racing. Talk to a reporter? The thought sent a wave of nerves through her. Did she really want to put herself back in the spotlight? She sat down at the kitchen table, the Harris hat resting in front of her. Slowly, she ran her fingers over the stitching, letting the memories of the past few days wash over her. When the confrontation first happened, she had wanted nothing more than to disappear. She had been embarrassed, humiliated, and afraid of what people might think. But now, she realized that staying silent hadn't made her feel any better. Maybe it was time to tell her story, not through a viral video or angry comments, but in her own words. Karen picked up her phone and replied to Tom, "Can you give her my number? I'll talk to her." The following afternoon, Karen sat across from a woman named Lydia Green, a journalist from a local news outlet. They met at a quiet cafe, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the main streets. Lydia was in her late 30s, with short brown hair and kind eyes that made Karen feel more at ease than she expected. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Lydia said, setting her notebook on the table. "I know the past few days have been difficult." Karen nodded, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "Yeah, that's an understatement." Lydia smiled sympathetically. "I want to tell your story, Karen, your side of it. Not the one people saw in that video. Can you tell me what happened that day?" Karen took a deep breath before beginning. "I was at the plaza to do some shopping. I saw the hat at a small stand and liked it, so I bought it. That's it. I didn't know about the controversy surrounding it, and I certainly didn't mean to offend anyone." Lydia nodded, jotting down notes as Karen spoke. "And when Jessica confronted you?" Karen's voice faltered slightly, but she pushed through. "It caught me completely off guard. I didn't know what she was talking about, and I didn't understand why she was so angry. It felt like she had already made up her mind about me." Lydia looked up, her expression thoughtful. "How did it feel when the video went viral?" Karen swallowed hard. "Awful. It felt like the whole world had decided who I was based on 2 minutes of footage. People who didn't know me at all were saying terrible things, like I was some kind of villain." "And what made you decide to speak out?" Lydia asked. Karen smiled faintly. "I guess I realized that if I didn't tell my story, someone else would do it for me. I made a mistake, an honest one, but I'm not ashamed of who I am. I just wanted people to hear the truth." Lydia set her pen down, smiling warmly. "That's brave, Karen. A lot of people wouldn't have the courage to do what you're doing." Karen shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know if it's courage or just stubbornness. But either way, I'm done hiding." The article ran the next day under the headline, "The Woman Behind the Hat: How Karen Hughes Found Her Voice After Viral Harassment." The story spread quickly, shared across local news stations and social media platforms. Karen's side of the story was finally out there, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in, some apologizing for jumping to conclusions, others thanking her for standing up for herself. "I was one of the people who judged you, Karen. I'm sorry. I should have known better. Thank you for speaking up. We need more kindness in this world. Your story reminded me not to judge others so quickly. Thank you for sharing it." Karen sat on her porch that evening, her phone buzzing with notifications. For the first time in days, she felt at peace. She had reclaimed her voice, and though the scars of the incident would linger, they no longer defined her. As the sun set, Karen picked up the Harris hat from the table beside her. She turned it over in her hands, smiling faintly before placing it back on her head. It was just a hat. But now, it was also a symbol, a reminder that even in the face of judgment, she had chosen to stand tall. The following weeks felt surreal. Karen's story spread further than she had ever imagined. Local news stations picked it up, and soon, it was featured in a segment on a national morning show. Today, we have a story about assumptions, misunderstandings, and the power of finding your voice, the host said cheerfully as they showed clips of Karen walking through the Shoe Zone Plaza, her hat perched proudly on her head. Karen hadn't sought out attention, but she couldn't deny the relief of finally being heard. For every negative comment still lingering online, there were dozens of kind messages and supportive words from strangers who had seen her side of the story. One letter, handwritten in careful script, touched Karen the most. "Dear Karen, I saw what happened to you on the news, and it reminded me of something my mom always used to say: be kind because everyone is fighting a battle you can't see. Thank you for reminding us to think before we judge. You handled everything with grace, and I hope you know how strong you are. Sincerely, Anna W." Karen kept the letter tucked in her purse, a reminder of the good that had come out of an awful situation. She wasn't bitter anymore, not about the hat, the video, or even Jessica. If anything, she hoped her story had taught people to pause, reflect, and choose kindness over assumption. One afternoon, as Karen browsed through the shelves of her favorite bookstore, a familiar voice broke her focus. "Karen?" She turned, her eyes widening slightly as she came face to face with Jessica Langley. Jessica stood near the end of the aisle, looking far less confident than she had outside Shoe Zone. Her arms were crossed, but her posture was unsure, her gaze darting nervously to the floor. Karen straightened, her heart pounding. "Jessica." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Jessica let out a heavy sigh, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't expect to see you here." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Why? Because I'm supposed to be hiding in shame?" Jessica flinched, her face flushing. "No, that's not what I meant." Karen folded her arms, keeping her voice calm but firm. "What did you mean?" Jessica hesitated, clearly struggling for words. "Look, what happened that day, it got out of hand. I was angry and I said things I shouldn't have. I thought I knew what that hat meant, but I didn't know you." Karen's expression softened slightly, though she kept her guard up. "So you assumed?" Jessica sighed, nodding. "Yeah, I assumed. And I'm sorry. I saw your interview and I guess it made me realize that I was part of the problem. I didn't give you a chance." Karen studied Jessica's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. But the other woman looked genuinely uncomfortable, her shoulders tense and her eyes downcast. For a moment, Karen considered all the things she could say, how Jessica had humiliated her, how the incident had spiraled out of control because of her accusations. But then she thought of the letter in her purse, the messages of kindness she'd received, and the lessons she'd learned through it all. Karen took a deep breath. "I appreciate the apology, Jessica. It doesn't change what happened, but I hope you'll think twice before doing something like that again." Jessica nodded quickly. "I will. I promise." Karen offered a small, forgiving smile. "Good." Jessica hesitated as though she wanted to say more, but instead she nodded once and walked away, disappearing down the aisle. Karen watched her go, a strange mix of emotions swirling in her chest. In the end, she realized forgiveness wasn't about letting Jessica off the hook. It was about freeing herself from the weight of anger and resentment. Later that evening, Karen sat on her porch, the golden hues of the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She sipped her tea, the Harris hat perched on the table beside her. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly at peace. The incident hadn't defined her. It had changed her, yes, but it hadn't broken her. In fact, she felt stronger now, more sure of herself, more willing to stand up for what she believed in. Her phone buzzed with a notification, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Tom, the Shoe Zone employee who had been so kind to her through it all. "Hey Karen, thought you might like to know. People have been asking for that Harris hat at the plaza again. We even sold a few today. It's funny how things work out, huh?" Karen chuckled softly, shaking her head as she typed a reply. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it? Thanks for keeping me updated, Tom." She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, gazing up at the sky. For all the chaos that had come from one simple hat, Karen had learned something she would carry with her forever. People were quick to judge, but they were also quick to learn. Sometimes all it took was one voice, one person brave enough to stand up and tell the truth, to make a difference. She reached for the Harris hat, brushing her fingers over the stitching before placing it back on her head. This time she wore it not because it was just a hat, but because it was her hat. And she wasn't afraid anymore. Epilogue, 1 year later. A year had passed since the incident outside Shoe Zone, but people still talked about Karen Hughes. Her story had become a reminder of the power of perspective, kindness, and forgiveness. Schools used her experience as an example in lessons about digital literacy and judgment. News outlets occasionally referenced her viral moment, calling it the day a hat sparked a conversation. As for Karen, she continued to live her quiet, simple life. The Harris hat sat proudly on a hook near her front door, next to her coat and scarf. She still wore it sometimes, not as a statement, but as a reminder of what she'd overcome. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Karen received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was neat and familiar. "Dear Karen, it's been a year since I saw you outside Shoe Zone and I've thought about that day a lot. I'm not proud of how I acted, but I wanted to thank you for handling it with grace. You didn't let anger win and you reminded me that we all make mistakes, even me. I hope you're doing well. Take care and thank you for teaching me something important. Sincerely, Jessica Langley." Karen smiled faintly as she folded the letter, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. Life had a funny way of coming full circle. She stood up, grabbed her coat and slipped the Harris hat onto her head. As she stepped out onto her porch, the sun warmed her face and she took a deep breath of the crisp, fresh air. The world wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. One conversation, one understanding, one small act of kindness at a time. And sometimes all it took to start that change was a hat.